Most of us know the story. A man, some claim to be the Son of God, is put to death on false charges of blasphemy and rebellion in Jerusalem. 2 days later, the third day of this ordeal, his tomb is found empty. His followers claim he rose from the dead. Others claim disciples stole the body. From this event emerged a splinter sect of Judaism that went on to become its own religion. A religion found all across the world 2,000 years later. To the present day, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday remain among the most important events in Christian belief. But was it all inspired, or even completely copied from earlier pagan groups? Well, no. Salvete, amici. Or since this video deals in ancient history, I should say, salvete, amici. I'm Patricius, and I'd like to talk about those articles that pop up around March or April every year. They come from multiple places, but they repeat many of the same claims, citing most of the same supposed evidence. They say that Easter, as a Christian celebration, was heavily influenced, if not completely copied, from earlier pagan beliefs and festivals. I'll be looking closely at 2 different articles making this claim, and I'll use modern historiography and ancient sources to demonstrate that these arguments simply fall flat. I'm not going to ask you to trust me. I want the evidence to speak for itself. This video will focus mostly on Easter. There are similar claims made about Christmas and other aspects of Christianity that deserve their own videos. It's not possible to address every claim about Easter in just one video either, but I'll try and counter some of the more common ones I've heard. Before I start, I'd just like to say that I mean no disrespect to the writers of any of these articles, nor to anyone who holds these views. I do believe, though, that polite discussion is a great boon for society and can help us all get closer to the truth. If by the end you're still unconvinced, I hope this can at least contribute to the discussion. Now, enough rambling. Let's have a look at the first article appearing in the UK newspaper, The Guardian. Easter is a pagan festival. Okay, I've got to respect that. They state their whole argument so clearly in the first sentence. One of the first claims it makes is the following. Early Christianity made a pragmatic acceptance of ancient pagan practices, most of which we enjoy today at Easter. Unfortunately, this claim is a bit outside the scope of this video. The idea that early Christians adopted pagan practices is claimed often, but it's so broad it would require its own video to address properly. Hopefully one day I'll be able to show that this simply isn't true, but for the sake of time, let's just gloss over it for now. The general symbolic story of the death of the sun, on a cross, the constellation of the Southern Cross, and his rebirth, overcoming the powers of darkness, was a well-worn story in the ancient world. Okay, so I really doubt the author is watching this video. I mean no disrespect, but it's a very strange sentence. First, sun and son only sound the same in heavily Germanic-influenced languages. For example, in Latin they would say filius for your male child and solis for the hot orangey thing in the sky. The second claim, that the crucifixion story was based on the Southern Cross constellation, it's very, very well established that the Romans used crucifixion, not just from biblical sources. Crucifixion was used against the slaves who Spartacus led in revolt. Robertson, on crucifixion history, demonstrated it wasn't just the Romans, but others used it before them. The Carthaginians would sometimes crucify generals for military disasters. The Romans, by contrast, used crucifixion on slaves and rebels. It was the worst punishment they knew how to inflict, and the very public manner in which the victims' pain and misery were on display to the public acted as a weapon of terror, intended to keep populations in line. There are plenty of parallel, rival resurrected saviors too. The Sumerian goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, was hung naked on a stake and was subsequently resurrected and ascended from the underworld. Okay, I'd like to answer this by taking a massive tangent.
One trick is to tell them stories that don't go anywhere.
Those familiar with mythology may recognize this story. A man, desperate after the love of his life dies, journeys to the underworld so that he might find her and bring her back to the land of the living. Did you guess I was referring to Orpheus and Eurydice? Or Izanagi and Izanami? Or, if you're also from the land of the long white cloud, the Māori legend of Hutu and Pare? If you guessed any of these, you'd be right. The tale of Orpheus and Eurydice is the most famous of these in the Western world, and is told by both Greek and Roman authors. Virgil and Ovid, among other authors, told slightly different versions, but the gist of it is that Orpheus was a famous poet of remarkable skill. His wife, through varying reasons, comes to be bitten by a snake and dies. Distraught, Orpheus travels through the Teneran Gate into Hades to find her. Upon finding her, and being a very high-level bard, rolls a nat 20 on his performance skill check.
Nerd!
Singing a song that leaves the Furies weeping. They then agree to let her go. They warn, however, that he must walk ahead of her on the way back to the land of the living, and must not turn around to look at her until they have emerged. At one point, the journey becomes foggy and very quiet. Orpheus starts to panic that she might have fallen behind. He turns around to look for her, and she speaks a final farewell as she fades back into Hades. Orpheus tries to cross the river Styx again to find her, but Charon the ferryman wouldn't allow a living man to journey to Hades a second time. If he hadn't turned around, he would have brought his dead wife back to life from the depths of Hades. Now, I'd like to take you to 8th century Japan. Izanagi was one of the kami, spirits venerated in Shinto. His wife, Izanami, had died giving birth. According to the Nihon Shoki, Izanagi, distraught at the loss of his wife, descended through the passageway into Yomi, the afterworld, in order to bring her back to the land of the living. This is a very simplified version, but essentially by the time Izanagi had found her, Izanami had already eaten the food prepared in the hearths of Yomi, and was now a walking, talking, but rotten corpse. Izanagi learns that because she had eaten the food there, it would be impossible to bring her back to the land of the living. Seeing her state, he becomes horrified, and an argument between the two ensues, leading to Izanagi being chased back to the surface world. He then pushes a massive boulder in the way of the passage to block it forever. It's strongly implied in this story that if Izanami had not eaten the food prepared on the hearths of Yomi, she could have been brought back to life. Now we journey to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Dating this story is difficult since it was an oral tradition. Māori did not have a form of writing, so it wasn't passed down until 1866. One article, comparing it to similar stories from native Hawaiians, estimates, though, that it's more than 1,000 years old. This story is very similar to the previous two I've just told. Pare was a puhi, a girl of noble birth who was kept guarded until she could meet someone of high enough rank to marry. One year, Rangatira, a chief, called Hutu arrives while Pare's people are having games and festivities. Hutu especially excels at niti, sort of like darts, and Pare becomes infatuated with him. Hutu doesn't return her affections, though, and strongly declines her advances before leaving. Pare, despondent and embarrassed, proceeds to hang herself and dies. In seeking Utu, a complex concept relating to justice, debt payment, and a return to balance, Pare's people track Hutu down and capture him, bringing him back to see her body. They intend to kill him, but he pleads with them. He tells them that they are right to kill him, but he has a plan. He tells them not to bury her, that he must go set things right and will return in a few days' time. Hutu left the village and begins a ritual through which he managed to contact Hini Nui Te Po, the goddess of night and the underworld, Rarohenga. From her, he learned how to get there, but she warns him, in a fascinating parallel with the previous story, not to eat any of the food down there, or else he will not be able to return. He travelled to Rarohenga and finds Pare's soul there. After some convincing, she was persuaded to return with him, and she had not eaten any of the food there yet. Hutu had the idea of how to escape. They got the souls there to tie ropes around a tall tree and bend it down until the treetop was near the ground. Then, climbing on the treetop, the ropes are released and they catapult to the roof of the underworld and dig through the soil to re-enter the land of the living. Hutu returns to Pare's people with her soul following, and upon seeing her body, her spirit returns to it. Pare is then brought back to life and the two of them marry. This tale has a happy ending. This massive tangent had a purpose. These stories developed independently of each other, yet they follow each other very closely. Geography makes it extremely unlikely that there was a link between the three of them. The far more likely explanation is that, as humans, we all share base cultural influences in common. Throughout history, cultures unconnected have independently believed that when people die, they don't just decompose, but the essence of who they are goes to another place, a land or world for the spirits of the dead. Countless peoples throughout history have lost loved ones and mourned for them, people who would have done anything to have them back. Countless cultures throughout history have also believed that certain people, either visible or invisible, have special power, either as gods or supernatural humans. Take these things common to every culture throughout history and combine them, and you can easily, independently, come up with the same story as these three unconnected mythologies. Now, let's return to the article in question. They suggest that Jesus' crucifixion on false charges of blasphemy and rebellion, of one who is both fully man and fully God, who has gone through the land teaching of a new covenant between God and humans, of repentance and forgiveness of our sins, of him taking on himself all the sins of the world before being put to death, thus putting to death the sins of those who turn to him, and his resurrection on the third day, that is, 2 days later, are based on Inanna's story. So, what exactly did Mesopotamians believe about Inanna dying and coming back to life? Inanna, or Ishtar, was a Sumerian goddess of fertility, sex, and war in ancient Mesopotamia. Under the guise of attending a funeral, she was said to have journeyed to Ker, the underworld, to secretly free her lover, Tammuz. She fears that her sister, the queen of the underworld, might destroy her soul, so she tells her allies if she is captured to demand her release, or otherwise find food and water that will restore her soul to her body. In the end, most of her allies refuse to help, but Enki, another Sumerian god, sprinkles her body with sacred food and water 60 times to return her to life. As you can probably see, Inanna and Jesus share almost nothing in common. In fact, Inanna's story is far more in common with the completely unrelated and much later stories that independently developed in Greece, Japan, and among the Polynesian peoples. The literary idea of resurrection after death is a very simple one, especially that most cultures, in one way or another, believed that spirits went somewhere after the body died. The myths of the lover journeying to the underworld to save the one they love share far more in common than Jesus and Inanna do, and yet no academic is going to suggest that ancient Greek and Roman myths influenced Japanese mythology, or Māori mythology for that matter. If these complex stories could be developed independently, based just off the shared human conditions of mortality and love, then we would need specific proof that early Christians were copying Mesopotamian mythology to justify what this article is suggesting. Death and returning to life are very simple literary ideas that don't come close to outweighing the differences in their stories. Finally, let's continue with the article. One of the oldest resurrection myths is Egyptian Horus. Born on 25th of December, Horus and his damaged eye became symbols of life and rebirth. Mithras was also born on what we now call Christmas Day. His followers celebrated the spring equinox. Even as late as the 4th century AD, Sol Invictus, associated with Mithras, was the last great pagan cult the church had to overcome. Okay, so before I get to this, there is another common myth going around that Horus was born to a virgin. This article doesn't suggest that, but some others do. That claim isn't true. Plutarch writes that after Osiris was killed and cut to pieces, Isis put him back together long enough to conceive Horus the way that most people have kids. For the sake of time, I won't repeat my arguments about simple literary ideas overlapping. Essentially, Horus may have been said to have been killed and then brought back to life. The character of Horus and the person of Jesus, however, have so little in common besides these claims. The idea of Christmas also being inspired by paganism is another topic that's so broad it would deserve its own video. But to quickly address this article's claims, Horus was not born on the 25th of December. The ancient Egyptians celebrated the festival marking Osiris's being pieced back together and Horus's conception during the month of Khoiak. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Eaton believed this to be mid-October to mid-November, but others suggested included December. The thing is, if Horus was conceived then, he wouldn't have been born until June to August. In regards to Mithras, Burke in his book states that Mithraism was a religion that didn't have any fixed public festival dates, so the claim that Mithras was born on December 25th is simply not true. It is generally believed that Sol Invictus, or Sol Invictus, was associated with Mithras, yes, and Sol Invictus may have had his birthday recorded as December 25th. However, this does not mean that Christianity copied it. The earliest mention of the celebration of Sol Invictus's birthday on December 25th comes from the chronograph of 354. The text itself is pretty hard-going, but the contents are explained by Chicago University historians who suggest that N Invicti means birthday of Sol Invictus. This is far from conclusive, as Invicti just means the unconquered one. It could be a reference to Sol Invictus, as it could also be to Jesus, who is sometimes said to have defeated death. Since the article is written in ancient shorthand, I do sometimes wonder why write Invicti and not Sol. This association is not definitively proven, but even if we leap to the conclusion that this is a reference to Sol Invictus, Christmas was already established to be on the 25th of December long before this date was attributed to Sol. Hippolytus of Rome wrote sometime around 200 to 220 AD, "The first advent of our Lord in the flesh, when he was born in Bethlehem, was December 25th. Hippolytus wrote the date of Christmas 150 years before the date was potentially attributed to Sol Invictus. In all likelihood, given Christianity's widespread by the time of 354, Sol Invictus worshippers may well have copied the date from us." The article continues, "In an ironic twist, the Cybele cult flourished on today's Vatican Hill. Cybele's lover, Attis, was born of a virgin." This claim can be similarly debunked. Attis was born from the male genitalia of Aegisthus, just in a roundabout way. It was cut off and thrown onto the ground. From where it landed, an almond tree sprung up, and a woman, years later picked one of the almonds, the almond disappeared and she became pregnant with Attis. Greek mythology could be kind of weird at times. Yes, we could technically consider this a virgin birth. Here's the thing. Pausianus wrote of this in his guidebook to Greece sometime between 143 and 161 AD, though it may have existed in oral tradition before that. St. Paul's letters to the Greek Christian churches, however, are widely considered to be dated to 50 to 60 AD. Thus, there were already Christian churches established, teaching of the virgin birth of Jesus in several parts of Greece a century before the earliest written reference to Attis supposedly being born of a virgin. The thing is, the New Testament isn't the first biblical mention of a virgin birth. Isaiah 7 verse 14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel." Saint Matthew in his Gospel, Matthew 1, 21-23, clarifies that Emmanuel means God is with us, and he believes Isaiah was prophesying the birth of Jesus. Now, Isaiah was writing during the Assyro-Ephraimitic crisis around the mid-8th century BC, around 800 years before the first written record of Attis's supposed virgin birth. St. Paul's letters and the Acts also demonstrate that there were also a great many Jewish people in Greece before Christianity was preached there. There is actually a fascinating history of ancient Jewish and Greek historical interactions, which I sadly don't have time to get into here, but let's get back to the article. Although we see no celebration of Easter in the New Testament, apart from the first Easter, 4 different accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, the only reason people actually mark this day. The authors of the Gospels were more interested in telling of Jesus and his teachings, less in telling how the early church chose to celebrate this day. The article says, "And today, many churches are offering sunrise services at Easter, an obvious pagan solar celebration." Sunrise is something that affects everyone. Pagans, Christians, and atheists alike. No one can claim a monopoly on it. Is it any surprise that people might want to start off a new day with a dedication to God? Besides, we don't worship the sun. The date of Easter is not fixed, but is instead governed by the phases of the moon. How pagan is that? Well, it's not pagan at all. Easter is to be celebrated the first Sunday after the Jewish Passover. Christians believe that our religion is a fulfillment of the promises of Judaism. The Gospel authors also make it clear that Jesus' death and resurrection happened around the time of Passover. The original Passover dates back to Exodus, the time when the Jews were kept in slavery in Egypt, and describes that each household is to sacrifice a lamb and eat of it that night. "And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. And the whole multitude of the children of Israel shall sacrifice it in the morning. And they shall take the blood thereof, and put it upon both the side posts and the upper door posts of the houses wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh that night roasted at the fire, with unleavened bread with wild lettuce. And I shall pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will kill every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be unto you for a sign in the houses where you shall be, and I shall see the blood, and shall pass over you. And the plague shall not be called upon you to destroy you, where I shall strike the land of Egypt. And this day shall be for a memorial to you, and you shall keep it as a feast to your Lord in your generations with everlasting observance." This is important. For the Jewish people, it was the final plague that freed them from their exile in Egypt, and remains an important festival to this day. In Christianity, it took on a new meaning. Our Easter celebrations are celebrations for the Passover, but a bit different. Jesus, in our case, is the Lamb who was slain on the cross. That is Good Friday. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, we believe he was resurrected from the dead. Catholic and Orthodox churches similarly eat of the body of the Lamb that was slain in the Eucharist. Some Protestant churches also do this, but most of those believe that the bread and wine are just symbols, making it an empty gesture. Good Friday took place on the Jewish feast of Passover. The Last Supper, held the night before, was them eating the Passover meal, where Jesus passed around the bread he called his body and the cup he called his blood, telling his disciples to do this in memory of him. Why did they eat the meal the night before? It's not really stated, but if your teacher, the one you believe to be at the very least a prophet, at most the Son of God, says to, they thought it best to do so. His death came after, on the actual day. Easter moves around because the Passover does. The Hebrew calendar that marked Passover was a lunar solar calendar, so it doesn't line up exactly with the Gregorian calendar we use today. The early Christians wanted to mark the death and celebrate the resurrection of our God, while keeping the connection to the Passover, which Jesus and his disciples celebrated. Though we nudge the dates a little, to make them always fall on Friday and Sunday respectively, there is nothing pagan about it. The article continues. All the fun things about Easter are pagan. Bunnies are a leftover from the pagan festival of Eostre, the great northern goddess whose symbol was a rabbit or a hare. This is another common but false claim. In English, the name of Easter may have its etymological roots in Eostre. In German, it may translate as Ostern, but this is not the case in most languages. In Latin, it is Pascha. In at least modern Greek, it is Pascha. Most early Christians spoke Greek or Latin. No offense to the author of this article, but the idea that Easter is based off of paganism because the name in English comes from pagan name is nonsensical. Christianity didn't reach England until significantly later. So, who was Eostre? And how did that name come to mean Easter in English? The goddess is mentioned in brief passing by monk and scholar St. Bede and is awesomely titled The Reckoning of Time. Well, reckoning meaning calculation, but anyway. Eostre's mention is so brief that, according to this article, whether Eostre was actually worshipped or not is a matter of debate among scholars. This name is not mentioned outside of St. Bede's work. Some scholars suggest that the quote is simply etymological fancy, whereas others suggest her worship was located in a small part of Anglo-Saxon Britain, though in fairness there are similarly named deities such as Ostara who are worshipped in other parts of the Germanic-speaking world. What does St. Bede actually say, though? Eostre Monath has a name which is now translated Paschal Month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs, Eostre, in whose honour feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate the Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honoured name of the old observance. So, why is Easter called what it is in the English-speaking world? St. Bede is telling us why. His book is about the calculation of time and the construction of calendars. He is simply explaining that in the past, the Anglo-Saxons, at least in one place, worshipped a goddess named Eostre, and they named a month after her on their calendars. Now that they're Christian, they still use the old calendar. At the time Easter occurs, it happens to coincide with Eostre Monath. We can see another example of this in the modern day. The month of July was named after Julius Caesar, or Julius Caesar. We still use it because it's just what everyone uses. Julius Caesar underwent apotheosis, becoming worshipped as a god, but that doesn't mean that everyone who has the month of July in their calendars worships Julius Caesar. July is just a name. The article continues, Hot cross buns are very ancient too. In the Old Testament, we see the Israelites baking sweet buns for an idol and the religious leaders trying to stop it. The problem for the Israelites wasn't that they were baking sweet buns, it's that they were being dedicated to an idol. Hot cross buns have never been dedicated to an idol. The early church clergy also tried to stop sacred cakes being baked at Easter. In the end, in the face of defiant cake-baking pagan women, they gave up and blessed the cake instead. This is not a claim I've heard before. Since there's no citation attached to it, I'm just going to have to try and guess what they're referring to. They might be talking about the ancient Greek sacred cakes. According to worldhistory.org, in an article, these were baked loaves, biscuits, pastries, and sponges sweetened with honey and offered to the gods and goddesses. If you read St. Paul's letters, you'll notice there's a lot of debate in the early Christian world about the eating of food sacrificed to idols. St. Paul was of the belief, in 1 Corinthians, that as the idols themselves had no power, it was okay to eat food that others had offered to them, though there are two caveats. It remained a sin to offer food to idols, as this is to worship others besides God, and it was a sin if it would cause scandal to others. Scandal would happen if others believed we were committing a sin, and beginning to have the mind that, even though it's a sin, it's okay to do. The matter of food sacrificed to idols was heavily debated in the early church. In Acts chapter 15, the Christians there believed it to be a sin. This topic wasn't finally settled until the Council of Florence in 1442. The second article I'd like to look at appeared on the History Channel website. I won't be going into this article in as much detail because many of the claims are similar, if not identical, to those in the previous one. For example, the first argument they make is about the Sumerian goddess Inanna. They then go to make the same claims about Horus and some similar claims about the Greek god Dionysus, before similarly suggesting that Easter is rooted in paganism. The author then contradicts themselves by pointing out that in most languages, Easter's name is some derivation of Passover. The article also makes similar claims about Eostre, which I didn't address in the previous one. Eostre was a goddess celebrated with a festival during the spring equinox, and according to some scholars, her association with hares is the origin of the Easter Bunny story, although this is still hotly debated. The article never provides citations, nor do they suggest who specifically had drawn a connection between Eostre and hares. I'm happy to be corrected on this, but my research suggested that Eostre's one mention in historical records was in St. Bede's work. St. Bede never mentioned rabbits being connected with Eostre. In my research for this, I've not come across any scholars who have suggested this connection. The article continues. However, it took until the 17th century before a German tradition about an Easter hare, known as Osterhase, which delivered eggs to good children, caught on. So they've just completely contradicted themselves again. If Easter is pagan, because the Easter Bunny was based off paganism, first it'd have to actually be relevant to ancient Christian Easter celebrations, which he clearly isn't. Even today, the Easter Bunny is little more than a commercial symbol, because shops and chocolate factories don't like putting religious symbolism into their products. The Easter Bunny is a fairy tale to get children excited for Easter. He's not actually relevant to the reason that we Christians celebrate this day. What about the Easter egg? Where did that come from? Dating back to ancient times, eggs, like the rabbits, have also been symbols of new life and fertility in various cultures. As Christianity absorbed pagan spring traditions, the egg was also adapted to become the perfect representation of Jesus' resurrection. The egg shell symbolizing the tomb, whilst the cracking of it representing Jesus' emergence, life conquering death. I don't actually disagree with this paragraph. but that doesn't mean that eggs are a pagan symbol. Eggs are how a great many animals are born. This isn't something that only pagans have seen, and pagans don't have a monopoly on using the symbolism of something that has been a common sight to most cultures throughout history. The article itself does point out the very Christian symbolism that ancient Christians saw in eggs. The hot cross bun, that delicious Easter staple, whose name and cross are said to symbolize the crucifixion of Jesus, is also believed to have pagan origins. A part of the pagan celebrations of Eostre, buns marked with a cross would be baked across pre-Christian Europe to celebrate the springtime goddess. The symbolism of the cross on the bun was said to represent the 4 seasons as well as the 4 primary phases of the moon. The bun was absorbed by Christianity and the meaning of its cross adapted. This is an unusual claim. Again, my research has suggested that Eostre was mentioned only by Saint Bede in that passage I described. I'm not sure where they're getting the idea that hot cross buns were associated with her, since it's definitely not in that text, and they don't provide any citation. That is not to say that pagan religions didn't have sacred cakes, breads, or buns. The history of the hot cross bun is very difficult to find reliable sources on. One of the most popular theories is that it was started in England by a monk at St. Albans Abbey in the 14th century, though some have also suggested that hot cross buns didn't emerge until much later. The final argument I'd like to talk about isn't explicit in either article, but it is hinted at and suggested in other places. It's the claim that Easter follows the spring equinox because it hijacked a previous pagan celebration. Here's the thing. In ancient times, when a large portion of any given population were involved in agriculture, tracking the passage of seasons became incredibly important. That's why so many archaeological discoveries are thought to be calendars, even Stonehenge. The seasons told people when to sow, when to reap, when to work, and when to rest. The spring equinox, as pointed out in this article itself, is the time when the length of daylight and nighttime are equal. In this author's own words, spring is a time of renewal and rebirth, as winter begins to fall away, with the promise of sunnier, longer days lying ahead. As Christians, we believe that the date of Easter, relative to the seasonal cycle, was preordained by God. It wasn't an accident. In the New Testament, in all the Gospels, Jesus says numerous times that he knows what is going to happen to him. Going to Jerusalem was a choice he consciously made and purposely chose to do during the celebration of Passover. Easter is a time of hope, of conquering death itself, and the promise of new life for those who seek it with a sincere heart. Here's the ultimate takeaway. If one is going to prove that Easter is based off of pagan ideas, they'd first need to put forward specific evidence that early Christians actually did it. I know that sounds circular, but that is where most of these articles fall apart. I mean no disrespect to the authors, but the claims made in their articles rely either on incorrect information or on putting too much emphasis on coincidental similarities that exist only on the surface. To say that Easter is pagan because another culture's myth of one who died and came back to life is not evidence of ancient plagiarism. Not when the similarities are only skin deep, not when the argument for plagiarism relies on very simple literary ideas that can and have been developed independently in different places. The fact that formerly pagan people of one of the most recently converted parts of the world kept the name of a month on their calendar is not evidence of ancient plagiarism. 2 celebrations that happen annually in the middle of the life-blooming season, on opposite ends of the continent, on the day when daylight and night are the same length, is not evidence of ancient plagiarism. There are a lot of other websites out there, posts on social media, and even news articles making these same unsubstantiated claims. If I get the chance, I'd like to make at least 2 more videos on similar topics, namely Christmas and the idea that Christians adapted to paganism at all. As I do have full-time commitments, these are projects I can only work on in my spare time, so it may be a while. In the meantime, I hope this has been informative, or at the very least, gotten you thinking. I believe in polite discussion, and so if you agree or disagree, or you just want to call me an idiot,
Who you calling Pinhead?
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. Until then, valete amici. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful Easter. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio, et nunc, et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.